Order, please. Before we begin the day routine, the subject for this evening's late debate was submitted by the honourable member for Hants East. Be resolved, the Minister of Community Services should stop making excuses and instead negotiate an end to the strike at the Regional Residential Services Society. Be debated this evening at 6 p.m. Begin the day routine presenting reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, today I want to share with the members here details about what the government is doing to improve safety across this province. As of today, new safety helmet regulations are coming into effect. Safety helmets are an effective way for people who use bicycles, motorcycles, inline skates, skateboard, and scooters to maximize the risk of their injury. Mr. Speaker, we are updating the existing regulations for people who use motorcycles and bicycles and introducing new regulations for those who use inline skates, scooters, and skateboards. By consolidating the existing regulations, the new regulations into one, we are reducing red tape, making it easier for police, for the people who use these devices, for everyone to understand the law. As well, we are updating the motorcycle and bicycle helmet regulations as many of the reference standards have changed over the years. The new regulations for inline skates, scooters, and skateboards reflect the continuing popularity of these devices. These regulations is designed to minimize the risk of injury to people who use these devices. While head traumas are relatively low in this province, the long-term effects can be devastating. To allow people to ensure they have proper safety helmets, we are recommending to our policing partners that there be a grace period until July the 1st, 2003 for people who use inline skates, skateboard, and scooters. As safety helmet regulations already exist for bicycles and motorcycles, there will be no grace period for people using these vehicles. Mr. Speaker, it is important to note that those who already have safety helmets will not likely need to buy new helmets. New helmets will not be required for anyone who is using a certified helmet in the way the manufacturer intended. As I mentioned, as the manufacturer intended is a key point. The regulations are designed to protect somebody who uses a helmet or recreational device in a normal manner. They are not intended to protect people involved in stunts or competition. As one would expect, the dangers are much higher in these situations and extra cautions should be taken. Similarly, a helmet certified for skateboard use is not acceptable for somebody riding a motorcycle. As always, Mr. Speaker, we look to adults to set good examples for the younger members of our society. If children and youth see their parents, their neighbors, and their relatives observing the law, it is likely the young people will adopt these safety measures. Mr. Speaker, this is one more step the government is taking to make the roads and the people who use them safer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, member for Halifax, Shabukto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister both for the statement and for the courtesy of allowing me to see the statement in advance of his reading it in the House today. The Minister's emphasis on safety for those who are out on the roads and not in motor vehicles is very important. I think everything that has been said is measured and correct. I look forward to actually reading the details of the regulations to get a better grasp of the exact details of how they will apply. But the main thrust, which is to emphasize safety for the people who are on scooters and bicycles and skateboards is indeed the correct way to go. And I'm glad the Minister and his department are turning their minds to this important matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the honourable minister for sharing an earlier report of his ministerial statement. I'm pleased to rise on behalf of my colleague, the honourable member for Clare, to respond to the ministerial statement with regards to helmet regulations. When I brought forward a private member's bill, which was tabled here in this House in the spring of 2001, I stated then that I did so not to embarrass the government in any way. I did so because I thought that the issue was important enough to prod the government into action. There are still people out there in our communities that are saying this is not an issue, people should have choice. But the studies and having seen children and people of all ages damaged by injuries from scooters and bicycles and motorcycles, then that surely is enough to prompt anyone to bring forward this type of legislation. So I'm pleased to say that it worked, and it worked finally. A little late maybe, some 2 years late, but it worked. And I must state from the outset that I am disappointed that it's taken the government so long to move on this issue. They tabled a bill here a year ago, and today they stand in their place and say that they are now ready. Well, I congratulate them on that, finally. However, Mr. Speaker, they have allowed a grace period until July the 1st this year, which I can understand. However, the grace period could have come earlier if this government had moved this issue a little faster. Mr. Speaker, this is a common sense piece of legislation. Anyone who has seen the effects of a head or a brain injury know full well the importance of ensuring that our children and our adults are well protected when engaging in recreational activities.
Order, please. Order, please. The member for Dartmouth East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't help but note the number of bicycle users in the HRM that are riding bikes without helmets. And I would hope that the Minister of Justice plays a role in addressing this issue, as well as ensuring that this piece of legislation is enforced. There is a role he must play, and I encourage very strongly that the Minister of Justice does so. While, like speeding, the police cannot stop everyone who violates the law, but the numbers not wearing helmets is far too high throughout the province, and putting lives at risk, their own lives at risk, and perhaps even the lives of others. So this is an education and it's an enforcement issue. In the spring of 2001, when this government debated the merits of the private member's bill, the then minister indicated that this is an issue of education and awareness and not an issue of legislation, that they were going to come forward and they were going to act. There was no need for my private member's bill. They were going to take action. So that's been 2 years later, Mr. Speaker, and now that's why I am so pleased to see this today and congratulate the government for finally taking some action. And now that the government has seen the errors of their ways with this statement, I hope that they'll put their money and put their programs in place where their mouth is today. I would also hope that given all the money that this government has been wasting on political advertising for their own personal agenda, that they plan to raise awareness on this issue. This is very much an issue that needs a heightened public awareness and support and commitment of government. This is indeed an issue of great importance, and one that the minister and this government must support with awareness through advertising and partnerships with enforcement agencies and groups such as the Nova Scotia Safety Council and all stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any further statements by ministers? Government notices the motion. The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Office of Health Promotion sponsored the Milk Energy Sport Fair taking place at Dalplex for the next 3 days. And whereas thousands of students from HRM will visit and have the opportunity to try over 30 different sports. And whereas we must help our province's youth adopt healthy lifestyle habits, such as physical activity, so that we can improve the long-term health of Nova Scotians. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize Sport Nova Scotia for producing this event that will allow Nova Scotia's youth to try a new sport they enjoy and become more physically active. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Notice the motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas when the New Brunswick Liberals unveiled their so-called solution to skyrocketing auto insurance rates, they stuck like glue to the private insurance companies, and whereas nevertheless the New Brunswick Liberal leader felt obliged to state that he would consider a driver-owned public auto insurance plan as, quote, the last resort, close quote. And whereas driver-owned, non-profit public auto insurance plans offer Canadians the lowest premiums and the slowest increase in premiums paid. Therefore, be it resolved that this House urge the Nova Scotia Liberals to explain why Liberals put a higher priority on the rapacious insurance companies than they do on ensuring the lowest and fairest insurance rates for maritime drivers. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Mr. Waiver, hear no. Noes is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Chief Edgar McLeod of the Cape Breton Regional Police Service has recently received the Order of Merit of the Police Forces, and whereas the Order of Merit of the Police Forces is a fellowship of honor that recognizes exemplary police service, and whereas the award recognizes the contribution to crime investigations, uniformed police patrol, training and development, research and development, research and publications, and achievements made over the course of the nominee's career. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Chief Edgar McLeod on receiving the Order of Merit of the Police Forces. I would ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Question waivers, is agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Eastern Shore.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I present this on the behalf of the MLA from Cumberland South. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the American Cancer Society developed the Relay for Life as its signature fundraiser in 1992, which was launched as a pilot project in Ottawa in 1999 for the Canadian Cancer Society, raising $85,000, and a further 9 events across Canada in 2000, raising more than $1.1 million, with $3.8 million in 2001 and $10 million in 2002. And whereas the first Relay for Life in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in 2002 raised $71,790, with 58 teams participating, averaging $125 in pledges for each individual participant. And whereas 5 Relay for Life events will be held across Nova Scotia in 2003 in Bible Hill, Bridgewater, Middleton, Sydney, and Halifax. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate cancer survivors Eleanor Cormier, Betty Adams, Marilyn Mitchell, and event participants Ann Rushton, Linda Scott, Mr. Speaker, Rob McDonald, Marion McDonald, Naomi Brown, Marilyn Fraser, Gloria Thompson, and Mrs. Rushton, and Nellie Gilroy of Spring Hill, Cumberland County, for their efforts to keep raising funds to find a cure for that dreaded disease of cancer by taking part in this year's Relay for Life event, and wish them much success in their endeavors. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver, and thank you.
Waivers, is agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Thank you. Thank you. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many Nova Scotians fear that our forests are being overcut and could go the way of the once bountiful codfish, and whereas to determine what is sustainable, we need to know the makeup of our forests, and whereas the Department of Natural Resources says their data shows the prime harvestable forest makes up 11% of the total, but also has other data that shows it comprises 32% of the total forest. Therefore, be resolved that the Minister of Natural Resources implement a standard, accurate method of determining the demographic of our forests so that Nova Scotians can plan for a sustainable forest industry, and I request waiver, notice, and passage without debate.
Waiver, I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. This one's an important one. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the government of today takes in $1 billion more yearly than it did back in 1999. And whereas the government has added $500 million to the debt since 1999. And whereas the government, if allowed to continue, plans to borrow another $600 million by 2013. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize that even with an extra $1 billion in his pocket, the Premier still can't provide adequate service, and he still can't stop the borrowing binge despite his promises to do otherwise. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waiver, here several noes. Notice is tabled. The honourable Minister of Community Services on the introduction.
Yes, thanks,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as is becoming a tradition now with the Evangeline Middle School, I'm very pleased to introduce a number of students and their teacher, Kathy Babcock, and chaperones, Mr. Greeter, Ms. Hawley, and Ms. Keddy. And I wonder if the students could please stand up and accept the warm greetings of the House, please.
We welcome our very special guest to the gallery today and hope that you enjoy the proceedings. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Robin Jessam of Bridgetown, who was a grade 7 student, chose the trombone because there were no trumpets left to play, is now the leading trombonist of his age in Canada. And whereas this fourth-year music student at St. Francis Xavier University recently returned from the Betty Carter's Jazz Ahead 2003 Festival in D.C., which identifies outstanding emerging artists, to find he has been chosen as a finalist in the prestigious International Trombone Association competitions. And whereas Robin will now travel to Helsinki, Finland in August to compete against 3 other young musicians from the world's top music schools in the Frank Rosolino Jazz Trombone Competition. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud Robin Jessam on his talent and dedication and cheer him on his upcoming competition and into his very promising musical future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Community Service on introduction.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this was the first half of the class, and in a moment there'll be another one. I was just indicating that I was hoping the opportunity to make a second introduction.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you. Yes, he was going to introduce me, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas noted consumer advocate Ralph Nader today praised George Jordan for his evident open-minded attitude, and whereas the Minister for skyrocketing insurance rates was eager to praise the Manitoba NDP for legislation establishing an independent claimant advisor who will assist people in appealing their insurance settlements. And whereas Mr. Jordan only has an 8-month contract, unlike a true consumer advocate, and the Nova Scotia has no legislation establishing either an independent consumer advocate or an independent accessible tribunal to settle insurance claims. Therefore, be it resolved that before the Conservatives and their Minister of skyrocketing insurance rates praise Mr. Jordan or other provinces, they should take care of their own backyard and adopt the consumer protections they pretend to admire. I seek waiver.
Request for waiver? I heard a no. The notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this being the first day of May and Gaelic Awareness Month, I would like your permission to read this resolution in Gaelic and followed by in English. A year last, Hami Marshaw and George and you, gun glorious me a Lara Cheerton, a Rons and Lennis. Chum Corrigas a Mish Cheerton, mar Mish na Gaelic. Agus a govel imog at your fay, and alba no golier of east, a Gaelic, we oasa fast. Agus a chum gun fast gamoan, a cola Gaelic, jay and goinov, horish, gam ola bliana. Marshin bashoitic, ga acha gabal kotumach, a veest and kolta, sho agus a horda molach. Don't faken, a lennis wish na Gaelic, a come up the all.
That's the way here.
Mr. Speaker,
Translation to Chinese now.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the month of May is celebrated as Gaelic Awareness Month, and whereas there are several communities across Nova Scotia where Gaelic instructions takes place, and whereas the Gaelic culture aspect of tourism is growing rapidly each year, therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge the importance of this culture and applaud the efforts of those who continue to keep the Gaelic language alive. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services on introduction.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I was just up a moment ago introducing students from the Evangeline Middle School and their teacher, Kathy Babb Cook, and the chaperones. And because there are so many that have come to join us today, we had to do it in shifts. So, second shift from the Evangeline Middle School with teacher Dennis Garrigan and chaperones Mrs. McPherson, Mrs. Strong, and Mrs. Weldon, and the students. And I would ask the students to rise and receive the warm ovation from the House.
Thank you. Again, we welcome our guests to the gallery today and hope to enjoy the proceedings. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this government passed, but never used, the infamous Bill 68 to impose a contract on healthcare workers because it claimed it couldn't afford to meet their wage demands. And whereas this government promises swift legislative action against a smoking ban in casino if it feels its revenue from the casino contract is in jeopardy. And whereas this government feels compelled to act when its own wallet is getting pinched, but has no such compunction to act while Nova Scotian families are penny pinching to pay the skyrocketing cost of auto insurance, therefore be it resolved that the Ham government show as much concern for today's families as it does for its own bottom line by rolling back unfair and backbreaking auto insurance rates. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Here or no? Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this government plans to increase the public debt by $600 million over the next 10 years, yet it has balanced the budget. And whereas current trends show that this government will add to the debt annually at least until the year 2013, yet it has balanced the budget. And whereas surely this is a new math in action, demonstrating that by accumulation of a series of debts and further increases in debits, one can actually claim to have beaten debt and thereby arrived at a surplus. Resolved that the Minister of Finance be hailed as Nova Scotians' #1 new mathematician, as he has demonstrated how by subtracting and subtracting you can add and thereby come out on top. Maybe we could have waiver of notice on that one.
Request for waiver. Here or no? Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the competition for President's Trophy Curling Award, a tradition for over a century, was recently held, and whereas the competition took place at the Blue Nose Curling Club, and whereas the winning rink was led by Skip Haylett-Clark and lead John Bootler and Bob Wallace, and third Victor Bellevue. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate the members of the team on capturing this year's President's Trophy in a sport so loved by the people of this province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver.
Request for waiver is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canadian Geographic's prestigious Canadian Environment Awards will be handed out in Toronto June the 2nd. Whereas Dalhousie educator and noted conservationist Martin Willison is nominated in Canadian Geographic's conservation category. Whereas Martin Willison's outstanding service to Nova Scotians and Canadians generally make him a superb candidate well worthy of such recognition. Therefore, be it resolved, this House thanks Martin Willison of Spryfield for his conservation efforts and congratulates him on being selected as a candidate for Canadian Geographic's prestigious Canadian Environment Awards, and I seek waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice in the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday in question period, the Premier indicated that it is the role of the federal government to come up with a Nova Scotia plan for paying for catastrophic drugs. And whereas the Premier encouraged the Liberal caucus to lobby the federal government for funding for such a program. And whereas the federal government in the next 5 years will invest in a health reform fund which can be used for catastrophic drug programs that will in fact bring some $475 million to our province. Therefore, be it resolved as the role of the Premier John Ham and his government to come up with a catastrophic drug program and not to lay blame on the federal government or the Nova Scotia Liberal Caucus. And I would ask for waiver of notice, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver. There's several noes. Noes is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Bedford Basin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Constable Stephen Smith was named the Halifax Regional Municipality's Police Officer of the Year for 2002. Whereas Constable Smith was chosen from a list of nominees for upholding a standard of distinguished public service in policing. Whereas examples of his service to our community include in 2002 helping to capture a murder suspect only seconds after the offence occurred and arresting and recovering stolen merchandise from a suspect following an armed robbery at a jewelry store in Metro. Therefore, be it resolved that the MLAs in this legislature commend the heroic and brave actions of Constable Stephen Smith and recognize his dedication to justice while in service to the residents of the Halifax Regional Municipality. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Eastern Passage Education Centre has a strong tradition of excellent athletic teams and has become a formidable force in junior high school athletics in its short history. Whereas at the recent Nova Scotia School Athletic Federation Wrestling Championships, Eastern Passage Education Centre won its third straight championship for the junior boys and its second straight intermediate girls title. Whereas Eastern Passage Education Centre won 5 individual gold medals, 12 silver medals, and 4 bronze medals at the championship. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate the Eastern Passage Education Centre on winning the NSAF Junior Boys and Intermediate Girls Wrestling Championships and recognize the individual medals won by Brian Kensley, Sean Day Finley, Brady Richards, Steve Gowan, and Kerry McQueen. And I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 15 months ago, the New Democratic Party rejected out of hand a proposal for an all-party committee to investigate and recommend solutions for rising insurance rates in Nova Scotia, which came from the Liberal Party. And whereas since then the NDP has spent much money, time, and effort to convince Nova Scotians that the problem identified by the Liberal Party actually exists. And whereas yesterday the NDP sent out new brochures with tear-off postcards asking Nova Scotians to tell them whether Nova Scotia families deserve the lowest and fairest insurance rates. Therefore, be it resolved. I threw mine in the garbage, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, be it resolved that the NDP do acknowledge that Nova Scotian families do indeed deserve the lowest and fairest insurance rates, stop wasting the public's time with silly exercises in pretend consultation, and step up with their proposal to resolve the problem of rising insurance rates. Mr. Speaker, maybe we could have waiver of notice on that. Seems to be some interest.
I hear a no. No's is tabled. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Barrington Municipal High Grade 9 students Luke Brandon and Jim Wickens placed first in the grade 9 to 10 level competition at the Tri-County District School Board Science Fair. And whereas the students' project involved testing various wing patterns for model rockets to determine which designs work best. And whereas the two will travel as part of Team Nova Scotia to the Canada-wide Science Fair in Calgary. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Luke Brandon and Jim Wickens on winning the top prize in their category at the Tri-County District School Board Science Fair and wish them much success in their future scientific endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable leader of the official opposition on introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On an introduction, although following the member from Cape Breton Nova, I couldn't help but notice that, Mr. Speaker, envy is a terrible thing. Terrible thing. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if we could welcome in the East Gallery the members of Local 66 of the NSGEU. They're obviously here to watch the proceedings today, and there are matters before the House that are of great importance to them, Mr. Speaker, and I would ask that we extend to them the welcome of the House.
Welcome our guests to the gallery today and hope they enjoy the proceedings. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview on the introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning Andrea Skinner was notified that she had won her appeal before an employment insurance board of directors, or board of referees rather. The decision stated that she did have just cause for leaving her position at the casino.
Order, please.
And Ms. Skinner joins us in the House today, and I'd like to ask Ms. Skinner, who's in the West Gallery, to rise and receive the welcome of the House.
Welcome our guests. Welcome our guests to the gallery today. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview on a resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canadian Geographic's Canadian Environment Awards are a prestigious recognition of community environmental action, and whereas this year's 17 finalists for the 6 awards that will be presented on June 2nd in Toronto have just been announced, and whereas environmental activist Belinda Manning of Coldbrook is a finalist in the Environmental Learning category, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulates Belinda Manning of Coldbrook for being selected as one of Canadian Geographic's National Award finalists and for working so hard to protect the environment in her community and her province. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice.
Question waiver is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the justice system is made up of many dedicated employees who ensure the wheels of justice turn smoothly on a daily basis, and whereas Judy Cook of Lunenburg is one of those dedicated employees who has always gone above and beyond the call of duty in doing her job, and whereas Judy Cook retired from her position at the Bridgewater Justice Centre after 17 years of total service, following a celebration held at the Justice Centre on April 30th, 2003, attended by her co-workers and many friends. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Judy Cook on her retirement and thank her for her many years of dedicated service to the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Tory backbencher Mark Perron used his weekly column to mock certain people and cultures, and whereas it is obvious from the backbencher's column that the John Ham government need a lesson in the history of Canada and a need to show respect for the many cultures in our country. Whereas the history of Canada does begin before 1867, but that beginning was not with the island of Great Britain or the country of England, but the First Nations people, and then later the French who settled here and became known as Acadians. Therefore be it resolved that John Ham government backbencher Mark Perron pick up a Canadian history book or talk to a member of the First Nations or Acadian communities before embarrassing this House, Nova Scotians, and all Canadians with his ignorance of history. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
We're here no. Notice table. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Doug Milburn of Fairview is the only surviving member of the original Stadacona Band formed during the Second World War, and whereas Doug will be honoured on May 2nd during the 5th Annual Battle of the Atlantic Musical Gala at Pier 21, and whereas Doug and his wife of 61 years, Trudy, have worked hard and raised their family in Halifax and continue to work to this day at their son Rick's business on Dutch Village Road in Fairview. Now therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly thanks Doug Milburn for his contributions as an original member of the Stadacona Band and wishes Doug and Trudy many more years of health and happiness. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough, Port Hawkesbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read this on behalf of myself, the MLA for Annie Ganesh and the MLA for Inverness. and hopefully supported by the MLA for Richmond. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in February, Jack Hartery Memorial Lifetime Achievement Award for business in Cape Breton and area was established, and the first of the annual award was given out recently by the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce. And whereas the award goes to someone who is a citizen of Cape Breton or Mulgrave for the majority of their business career, must be continuously operated in those areas for at least 20 years, have high ethical standards in business and personal dealings, and most importantly, the award recipient should be considered a good employer and have the respect of their community. And whereas receiving the first ever Jack Hartery Award is Joe Shannon, President of the Atlantic Corporation and member of the Junior Achievement of Nova Scotia Business Hall of Fame 2003 Board of Governors, an honored Cape Breton businessman who fulfills with distinction the criteria for the award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Joe Shannon on receiving the first Jack Hartery Memorial Lifetime Achievement Award and wish him continued success in his future endeavors. And I ask for a waiver.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Truro Hub Club won the 2003 Nova Scotia Juvenile Girls Volleyball Championship, beating the Metro Lakers in straight sets. And whereas the Hub Club entered the playoff round as the #1 ranked team after compiling an 8-0 record in preliminary action. And whereas the Truro Hub Club played in 8 tournaments this season, reached the finals in each, and won 5. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Truro Hub Club players and coach Bob Pierce on their outstanding season, which was culminated by winning the Nova Scotia Juvenile Girls Volleyball Championship. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Federation of Anglers and Hunters held its 73rd annual convention and meeting recently, and whereas the Federation of Anglers and Hunters is the province's oldest and largest conservation organization, whereas Gary Penny of Upper Northfield, Nova Scotia, has been re-elected for a second term as President of the Federation, therefore be resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Gary Penny on his re-election as President of the Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass it without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Future days shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Harbach's Home Hardware has been named one of the top dealers across the country by Home Hardware Stores Limited, and whereas chosen from over 1,000 locations from coast to coast, this Glace Bay business was cited for achieving the highest standards in retailing, merchandising, staff performance, and overall quality. And whereas brothers Jamie and Fred White, co-owners of the Harbach's Home Hardware, modestly attribute their success to their loyal customers, but they've proven that the key to retail success is providing what customers want. So therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the owners and staff of Harbach's Home Hardware in Glace Bay for their business success, especially through some very uncertain economic times. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day or question put by members. Question period to begin at 12:42 and end at 1:42. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance rates. You know, Mr. Speaker, the minister was talking tough yesterday, but outside the House, the insurance companies were hiking rates, pushing people into the insurer of last resort, and arbitrarily setting new rate categories to further fatten their profits. So I'd like to ask the minister, will the minister explain why his government is not seeking approval this spring of legislation to lower the intolerable auto insurance premium rates?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to advise the Leader of the Opposition that we have a plan, that our...
Order.
I will tell them once again, Mr. Speaker, I've been telling them for the last month that we have a plan, and I would expect that sometime perhaps early next year, we'll be able to issue the first plank of that plan.
The honourable leader of the official opposition on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not a plan, it's a scheme. Mr. Speaker, when nurses and other healthcare workers were the Ham government's target, they forced this House to set 24 hours a day to try and impose wages and working conditions. This House, Mr. Speaker, has the power to outlaw discriminatory practices, the power to outlaw arbitrary rate classifications, and, Mr. Speaker, the power to lower rates. But you know, Mr. Speaker, this government's theme is, we gotta get out of this place. Well, Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister, will the Minister of skyrocketing insurance rates explain why his government has decided to leave Nova Scotians at the mercy of the insurance industry?
The honourable leader of the honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that I misspoke myself a moment ago when I said that we would have an announcement early next year. I meant early next week, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honourable members opposite that we have the concerns of the consumers of this province at heart, and we are taking action to do something about the insurance rates in this province.
I will leave the official opposition on your final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. No wonder the minister is confused. It seems their position on this matter changes every other day, so I'm not surprised he confused next week with next year. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, we hope it bears no resemblance to the kinds of approaches they've had to things like long-term care, which have been insufficient and essentially just to placate people long enough to get past the election. When insurance companies are involved, Mr. Speaker, the Tories speak softly and carry no stick, despite the fact that rates are exceeding 65%. So my question is this: why is this government so beholden to the private insurance industry that it will also run away from decisive action rather than fight for Nova Scotia drivers?
The honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Speaker, contrary to what the honourable member is spouting across the way, this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, is not in bed with the insurance industry. We are going to do everything we possibly can, Mr. Speaker, to rectify what are atrocious rates for insurance in this province.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in Public Accounts, we learned that the public sector pension plan and the Teachers' Pension Fund, as of November 30th of last year, had a $1.5 billion unfunded liability. Speaker, on February 8th of this year, I was told by the Minister of Finance that he would reveal the pension losses to all Nova Scotians by the end of April. Mr. Speaker, the end of April is now upon us, and still the Minister will not reveal any information on what appears to be massive losses to our public service pension and teachers' pension plans. So, Speaker, in Public Accounts, we learned that we would not know the actuarial report until at least June, but the department did advise that they do receive regular updates as to the status of these pension plans. My question to the Minister of Finance is, will the Minister live up to his commitment and table with us the current status and value of these plans so that Nova Scotians can have the full facts as to what they could possibly be liable for under these plans?
The honourable Minister of Finance.
Speaker, to the member opposite, in regards of the financial statements in regards of the pension plans, and there are two. One is the public sector superannuation plan, public sector superannuation plan. The other one is a teacher's pension plan, for which I'm responsible, Mr. Chairman. As he indicated in his opening, in his question, the statements will be ready in June, Mr. Speaker, and I will table them. I should point out that last year, those financial statements were tabled in the House in the fall. So actually, by coming forward in June, Mr. Speaker, that will be considerably in advance of what was tabled last year.
The honourable member for Richmond on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what this means is that if all of our teachers and all of our civil servants were actually to retire today and collect what is due to them under this plan, the taxpayers in Nova Scotia would be on the hook for $1.5 billion. Now, clearly, Mr. Speaker, this is of clear concern to all Nova Scotians as to what the real financial health of this province is. Mr. Speaker, $1.5 billion is a considerable amount of money by anyone's standard, yet the Minister doesn't feel fit to provide us with any information as regards the status of these plans and has made but one small reference to it in his budget speech. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are clearly asking why won't the Minister give information on these plans. My question is, in the spirit of openness, accountability and transparency, will the Minister table any analysis, reports, and most importantly, the most recent updates that your department has received of these pension plans and their performance so that Nova Scotians can have a clear picture as to the financial health of this province?
Minister of Finance.
Speaker, first of all, the member opposite is, I think, in a sense, trying to say that the pension plans are not healthy. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, that is not the case. Nova Scotia has one of the best pension plans in Canada in the sense of its of how much it is funded. There are provinces in Canada, Mr. Speaker, which have almost virtually 100%, I shouldn't say 100%, but virtually most of it being unfunded. That is not the case in Nova Scotia. And I should also point out, Mr. Speaker, they would be in much better shape if the Liberal government that he was a member of hadn't given a holiday, Mr. Speaker, in the pension funds, which basically cost over $200 million, Mr. Speaker. That was part of their election ploy when they were in office, and that did not help the situation that we find ourselves in today.
Order, please. The member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the facts speak for themselves. Under the Liberal government, the public service plan was 100% funded. Under the Tory government, it's $500 million underfunded. Nova Scotians will judge for themselves as to that performance. Mr. Speaker, if there's nothing to hide and nothing to fear with these plans, why won't the Minister simply table the information that his department has? The Deputy Minister clearly said yesterday they received regular updates as to the status of this plan. He said they received quarterly updates, yet only gave us the November 30th numbers from last year. They clearly must have more up-to-date information. If there is nothing to hide, then the Minister shouldn't hesitate to provide this House today with the exact details they have as to the status of those plans since November 30th in that reporting period. Mr. Speaker, bond ratings will be looking at this. Nova Scotians will be looking at this. Will the Minister finally live up to his commitment to provide us with the detailed information as to the current health today of these two major pension plans instead of continuing to stonewall and delay this information?
Mr. Finance.
Mr. Chairman, I've indicated to the member opposite when the financial statements are finalized that I will table them. The member opposite yesterday was advised by the controller of the province of Nova Scotia that they will be finalized in a form by June, and as such, that's when I will table. The member opposite is asking me to present individual components of that information, Mr. Speaker, which will not put it in proper context. He should receive all the information, also the actuarial estimates are incorporated into those financial statements, Mr. Speaker, which shows the cost of what the payments will be when they do come out. That's all important information, and the proper context is to have the final statements, which will be tabled in this House, Mr. Chairman, or with the clerk of the Assembly in June, or as soon as earlier if they're ready.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I know that the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance premiums takes a happy-go-lucky attitude toward this issue. The reality is that Nova Scotians can't afford to. More and more, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the growing discrimination by insurance companies. And some of these cases really make you shake your head. Yeah. Like the case of the Lee family from Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker. Ricky and Margaret Lee are both over 50. Over the last 30 years, they have had one minor accident. Recently, they had a seatbelt infraction, and now their insurance is shooting up by 138%. So my question is for the minister who believes that all flat roads lead to Manitoba and to lower auto insurance premiums, is this. Why does your government continue to tolerate such blatant abuse of drivers by insurance companies in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Speaker, our plan is in place, our plan is moving forward, and the conclusion of that plan will be fair insurance rates for all.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the sad fact is that families like the Lees are becoming less the exception and more the rule. The Fobbins, Shirley and Tom, are already paying $1,300 a year for car insurance. They just received notice that a seatbelt infraction will cost them an extra $159. Now, this is completely unfair, and it is above and beyond the fine that they have already paid. We understand, Mr. Speaker, that even minor infractions should be dealt with so that our roads are safe. But fairness, Mr. Speaker, also has to be observed. So I'd like to ask the Minister, how does the Minister justify the continued gouging of Nova Scotia drivers while his government stands by and does absolutely nothing?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, it's not my intention or the intention of this government to countenance gouging in any form.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you're insured with ING and you've had a moving traffic violation in the last 3 years, get ready to pay up. I will table documents showing that ING, one of the many companies engaged in this practice, is making new drivers, or those who renew, pay surcharges for things like seatbelt infractions. My question for the Minister is this, why is your government colluding with the insurance companies to allow this discriminatory behavior to continue?
The Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I consider that question improper. Mr. Speaker, the word colluding has inferences I'm sure that the honourable member would not want to use, but I can assure him that we are not colluding with the insurance companies.
The member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, for the second time in less than a week, we hear from a national organization that Nova Scotia is not properly funding its universities, and it's costing us. Last week, the editor from Maclean's magazine Guide to Universities stated that Nova Scotia's funding is almost preposterously low. Now the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says Nova Scotia is ranked last because of the relatively low amount of government money it puts into higher education. And the reason Nova Scotia is last is not because Ontario, which was last, got better, it's because Nova Scotia got worse. My question, Mr. Speaker, is when will this minister and this Tory government realize that university funding has to be seen as an investment and not a cost for this province?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member, in referencing the Ontario-based left-wing think tank, would be well to note that that think tank, Mr. Speaker, does not truly identify the point at which funding to our universities got worse in this province. In 1993, we were contributing $212 million to universities. In 1998, we contributed $175 million, and that government cut the funding to universities. We have restored funding by an amount of over $30 million, Mr. Speaker, in recent years, and we will continue to support our universities.
Now, member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister clearly doesn't understand the situation, so let me reference the students, Mr. Minister. Let me reference the students. One of them in particular, the president of Dalhousie University Student Union, who says, and I quote, "This government has put education on the back burner since the get-go. We have the highest tuitions in the country. We have students graduating with the most debt in the country. Students have to mortgage their future in order to get an education." Unquote, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, when is this minister and this government going to wake up and realize they can't continue to inadequately fund Nova Scotia's universities?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And students in this province and the people of this province understand that tuition increases began when they slashed university funding from $212 million down to $175 million. We have restored university funding, and indeed Dalhousie, St. FX, and Acadia give us credit for having moderated the increase in university funding for the additional $6 million we provided this year. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to support our universities, and we will restore funding to the levels they were at before that crew cut them so savagely.
Member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education may want to check with the President of St. FX, who did not say that, Mr. Speaker. The President of St. FX said he didn't think that it would stop tuition rates from going up, Mr. Speaker. Check your quotes, Mr. Minister. This minister is missing the facts in everything, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia went from 6th place to 10th place. We have the highest tuition fees. We respond poorly to the financial needs of university students. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a level of commitment that's required here, and to address the crisis, the government doesn't come close to meeting it. My final question for the minister is, Mr. Speaker, will the minister put aside the empty promises and the blaming of others, put all of that aside, and tell us his plan to improve Nova Scotia's reputation when it comes to investing in universities?
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member would know, if he would take the time to realize it, that Nova Scotia has the second highest funding in the country on a per capita basis with respect to university funding. And, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member opposite wants to truly do something to assist universities, they couldn't do it when they were in power, but they could prevail upon their federal cousins to adequately fund Nova Scotia's university students, because if we were to spend all of our money on Nova Scotia students only, then we would be the 4th highest in the country, Mr. Speaker. So go to your federal cousins and get us some help.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, Jerry Harrod is an 85-year-old former minister and teacher. He is suffering from Parkinson's and must enter a long-term care facility. His daughter Kathy came to Nova Scotia from Alberta to make arrangements for her father's care. When she got here, she got the shock of a lifetime when she realized that her father would lose everything he has to pay for health care in the nursing home. She didn't realize, Mr. Speaker, that seniors paid for health care in Nova Scotia, so I would like to ask the Premier. Your government was willing to act quickly when you thought the casino might cost the province money, but why are you willing to drag your feet as seniors continue to lose their life savings?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there's no question that there are some inequities and injustices in our present system for caring for seniors, and that's why we're moving to address that problem over the next number of years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, by Kathy's calculations, her father will pay for health care for 4 or 5 years before his savings run out. That means that his bank account will run dry just about the time the Tories plan to finally stop taking seniors' assets. Not one single government exemption that the government has introduced will apply to Reverend Harrop. He sold his home, his vehicle, and his spouse passed away. Every dime he has ever saved will go to pay for his health care. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of Health, why is tens of millions of dollars seniors will lose before 2007 less important to you than the $100 million that the government might lose if people can't smoke at the casino?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as I said, we are moving to correct the situation with some seniors in nursing homes, although the member opposite does realize that about 80% of the people in nursing homes are funded by the government. But Mr. Speaker, it's not my place to speak about the casino, but I would say a figure of $120 to $140 million would total just about the whole federal Medicare transfer, and that's not something I am prepared to throw away as the Health Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to add insult to injury, Reverend Harrop isn't only paying $50 a day, the $50 a day fee while he waits in hospital for a nursing home bed. Kathy has had to hire a private nursing service for an extra $90 a day because there are too few nurses on her father's floor. While this government drags its feet on this issue, seniors like Reverend Harrop continue to pay and pay and pay. I want to ask the Minister of Health, how can you justify the unfair treatment of seniors when you have the power to end it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we are ending the current situation with some of the seniors in nursing homes, but we are doing it over time, Mr. Speaker. I think most Nova Scotians understand that oftentimes plans have to be undertaken over time in order to be sustainable and successful. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. My mistake. The Honourable Member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is another sad day for students in this province, and it's another day which brings more independent confirmation of what students and their families already know. The Nova Scotia post-secondary system is in crisis. In fact, it's in the tank, as an impressive young woman that I'm fortunate enough to call my daughter said to me as she left for Northern Ontario to plant trees. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative ranks us last in university support, and I will table a copy of these statistics. But not only are we last, we had the biggest overall decline from 6th to 10th, the lowest possible ranking. We're far behind in accessibility, we're far behind in funding, and we're far behind in the quality of education. And try as he might, this Minister of Education can't blame someone else for that. My question for the minister responsible for skyrocketing student debt: when will your government listen to students and their parents and freeze tuition fees?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
I'm not the minister responsible for skyrocketing debt.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member raised the question which has previously been raised in the House, and what the Ontario-based or centred institute does not reflect in its figures is, of course, the fact that Nova Scotia contributes on a per capita basis the second highest funding in the country for our students. And as I indicated in a previous answer, Mr. Speaker, if all of the money that we contribute toward education in this province were to go to the support of Nova Scotian students, it would be quite a different picture. Mr. Speaker, we have begun the process of restoring funding to our universities. We have come forward with a debt reduction plan for our students. We will continue to address this concern, and the facts of history are not a matter of apportioning blame, but they are simply facts of history that the funding was severely cut in a time when we were not in office.
Member Timberley Prospect, on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let me inform the minister how Nova Scotia ranked in some of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative categories. On accessibility, we're 8th out of 10th. Now, I have a young woman who attends Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and I want you to know how hardworking the staff are, how much they prize the reputation of that particular institution, and I know that the minister opposite, from where he's from, knows how hardworking the professors at a Antigonish campus called St. Avex, or here in Halifax are working, or at the College or University St. Anne. But, Mr. Speaker, they can't continue to do more with less. When will this minister admit that chronic underfunding by his government is preventing many deserving young Nova Scotians from achieving a university education?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. And we are, as I indicated previously, we are working toward restoring the funding to universities. And while we're in the process of doing that, we still have in this province among the best universities in the country, and they are attracting out-of-province students by the thousands, Mr. Speaker, and they are credible institutions. We will continue to do our part to support them as funds become available.
The honourable member Kimberley Prospect on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While this minister stands and touts a 3% funding increase to university, he fails to mention last year's funding freeze. The study found that Nova Scotia's government grants as a percentage of the post-secondary budget were once again lowest in the country, at the bottom of the barrel in this country. The effects of 10 years of Liberal and Tory governments are shown in this independent report. Will the minister responsible for skyrocketing student debt tell this House why he's making all the same mistakes that his Liberal predecessors made?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
The honourable member seems to have great difficulty in distinguishing between cutting funding to university and increasing funding to university. We have increased funding to the universities. We will continue to increase funding to universities. We will work with the universities to develop a long-term funding agreement with the universities so that they can plan. And there's a huge difference, Mr. Speaker, in going from $212 million down to $175 million, as opposed to restoring the amount up toward $212 million, which is where we are going, and we will be getting there, Mr. Speaker, and continue to support our universities.
The honourable member Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, there was a time when the Energy Conference at Euston was the centerpiece of the year for the province of Nova Scotia in the offshore. In the past, Mr. Speaker, there were no companies based in Halifax, so we had to travel to Euston. When we did travel to Euston, the Premier often led the delegation, and we come back with concrete commitments for development and exploration. In fact, Mr. Speaker, even opposition parties were invited at one time to go to Euston. I would Mr. Speaker, suggested that the go-forward position for Sable occurred at one of those conferences in the past. And we know, Mr. Speaker, there was a large number of Halifax-based companies going this year. We hear that. And my question to the minister is, will the minister table in this House before the end of the day information including how many companies from rural Nova Scotia and Cape Breton will be attending the conference this year, who will pay for the junket, and how much will it cost the provincial taxpayers?
Order, please. I believe the honourable member included all three questions in that one first one, but the honourable Minister of Energy like to... Order, please. The honourable Minister of Energy would like to answer one of those questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as the honourable member said, it is an important conference, and many Nova Scotia companies are going. And unlike when the member opposite led it, it was a junket. This time, Mr. Speaker, there's 26 Nova Scotia companies going, and they're paying their own way, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member Cape Breton South on your first supplementary.
At least when we went, Mr. Speaker, we brought back results. This government has brought back nothing in the offshore in the 4 years I've been going over there. Mr. Speaker, my first supplementary is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians need to know that the tax dollar is being used to foster development, not kill it like this government has done. Mr. Speaker, the offices of Encana are right here in Halifax, at least for now, as are Exxon, El Paso, and Heritage Gas. In fact, gas distribution is an issue that concerns Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, last October, the Premier said he was disappointed in the Heritage plan to provide gas to 4,000 homes in 10 years. And, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, how much closer is Nova Scotia to allowing for disappointing gas distribution because of the Euston Conference?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer that to the Minister responsible for Energy.
Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there was a number of questions there, but I choose to answer the one about accomplishments. Certainly, there's no question the SOE project is an important project for Nova Scotia, and the first one coming ashore. But I want to assure the member opposite that $1.56 billion worth of exploration work already booked is a significant achievement, and we'll see more.
Member Cape Breton South on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is that nothing has happened under the watch of this minister or that Premier in regards to the offshore.
Right.
Mr. Speaker, leadership for the offshore must be provided here in Nova Scotia. The Houston trip has not amounted to one more project or one new discovery since the current government took office. It has not resulted in an expansion of the industry from the one project. Now we can't even get gas distribution after 4 years. And again, Mr. Speaker, I know I run the risk if I ask the Premier this question again, he'll have it diverted to the Minister, and that'll be the 83rd time in this session of the House that that's happened. But my final supplementary, and I'll try the Premier on in any case, what do you have to say, Mr. Premier, for yourself after 4 years of missed opportunities and no gas distribution as yet for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the misdirected efforts of the previous government in terms of setting unrealistic targets has not worked. We went back to the drawing board and came up with a plan that will have a reasonable chance of succeeding. And we are expecting that gas distribution will start to occur in Nova Scotia. But it will only occur, Mr. Speaker, if in fact the situation is reasonable, that the business plan makes sense, and in fact that gas is affordable to Nova Scotians.
The member for Halifax Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, today former casino employee Andrea Skinner was notified that she had won her employment insurance appeal. I'd like to table a copy of that decision so the Minister of Health can read it, so the Minister for the Gaming Corporation can read it, so the Premier can read it, and the Minister of Environment and Labour can read it. This decision should send a signal to this government: exposure to environmental tobacco smoke is a workplace hazard. So my question to the Premier: now that it has been determined by an EI Board of Referees that the casino is a hazardous workplace, is your government still going ahead with the exemption?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer that to the Minister responsible.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite always seems to admit that the legislation that we propose is permissive legislation. He always seems to put forward as if this is a done deal. Speaker, we will only move forward on this legislation if and only if the casino puts forward a termination notice to the province. And I've also indicated to the member opposite that if that is the case and government does act on that, our intention is to go forward to a dispute resolution process subsequent to that. And Mr. Speaker, if that dispute resolution process comes forward and says that that is not a material breach of the contract, Mr. Speaker, this government and this caucus will be only too pleased to let the bylaw that was proposed by municipalities stand, and we reverse that decision.
Now, member Halifax Fairview on your first supplementary.
My gosh, Mr. Speaker, that sound we all hear is the furious sound of backpedaling. Mr. Speaker, the Board of Referees says, and I quote, "There is sufficient medical evidence to substantiate the hazards of secondhand smoke in the workplace," end of quote. And yet, at the same time, this government is proposing legislation it knows will harm the health and safety of the Nova Scotians who work at the casino. Risking death by tobacco smoke should not be a condition of employment. My question to the Premier: why is this government creating laws that he knows full well will damage the health of Nova Scotians?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I've just had delivered to the front bench the copy of the decision that the member opposite has made reference to, and we will be studying the decision. I think the happy thing about all of this is it is a case about worker protection, and it would appear that the system worked for the worker, and I'm happy about that. On the other hand, I'm not happy about a situation that would require the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, the people that pay for health care and roads and education, would have to cough up $120+ million to purchase a casino, which is what that member is suggesting.
Now, member Halifax Fairview on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Andrea Skinner got out of the casino before her workplace made her sick or gave her a permanent and serious illness. The next employee might be another Heather Crow. I'm sure the Premier remembers Heather Crow, who might not be so lucky, and the next case could well be for workers' compensation, negligence, or even wrongful death. So my question to the Premier: why is it the Premier can come up with creative ways to hide program cuts, but the Premier can't find a better way
to protect Nova Scotia workers from secondhand smoke.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this government did take the bit in its teeth, something which the preceding government did not do. It introduced the toughest anti-smoking legislation in the entire country. Unfortunately, in addition to not coming forward, the previous government did not come forward with anti-smoking legislation. They also tied us into a very, very difficult casino contract that we are dealing with in the best way that is possible.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, this morning I attended the first ever symposium on suicide in Nova Scotia at Mount St. Vincent University. Today and tomorrow, people from across the province are discussing their experiences and knowledge about suicide and its prevention. Suicide rates here are the 4th highest in Canada, Mr. Speaker, and suicide is the leading cause of death in males between the age of 10 and 49. Yet, Nova Scotia does not have a clear suicide prevention strategy. So I want to ask the Minister of Health if any work presently is being done to create a suicide prevention plan for Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And suicide is a very a sensitive matter, and I will get back to the member opposite on any updates we may have. I do think that the part of a plan to address suicide would certainly be some of the work we have done and the increase in the work we will do in the mental health area, something we have devoted considerable resources to in this year and in the coming years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, 4 provinces in Canada, New Brunswick, Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec, have well-defined suicide prevention plans and programs. In Quebec, there is even a legislative framework around addressing suicide. Mental health services in Nova Scotia, as we all know, are inadequate, especially in rural communities, and untreated mental illness is a major factor in suicides, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the Minister of Health, there are many examples out there to use as a framework for a strategy in Nova Scotia. When will such a strategy be developed for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, I'd be glad to supply all the information and policies we have right now in the mental health field that deal with suicide prevention and helping out the families of suicide victims. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, between 1998 and 1999, suicide deaths in Nova Scotia increased by 11%. In 2001 came the disturbing news that gambling, Mr. Speaker, is a factor in over 6% of suicides that we know of. So I want to ask the Minister of Health, why are so few resources put into mental health and gambling addiction programs in light of this information?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the question of gambling, I would refer to the Minister of Health Promotion. However, I would like to answer the question in more general terms. And there are many factors in suicide. Gambling is one. Drug and alcohol addiction is another. Inherited mental illness is another. It's a very complex situation, Mr. Speaker, that we are trying to address in a more complete way than we have. But, Mr. Speaker, I will tell you one thing that will not help, and that is the continued encouragement of a culture of victimhood in Nova Scotia that the NDP continually asserts in this House. Thank you very much.
Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister of Community Services. And, Mr. Speaker, today again we see the classic Tory politics at work. We see the hand of the Premier and the Minister of Community Services playing the familiar game of divide and conquer with the families and with the staff members of RRSS who care for the relatives of family members. They are trying to drive a wedge between those two groups. Mr. Speaker, this is leaving the vulnerable clients in the middle of a very cruel game being executed by this government. My question to the minister, why does the minister see this type of government strategy as acceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the chance to point out how in this House and outside of this House.
Please. There's too much noise in the chamber. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would point out to the member opposite that I've been very circumspect in the way that I've respected the collective bargaining process and always in this House and outside the House, and I will continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about respect for vulnerable people in our society and respect for those people that serve them. And this government does not do that. The government sees the workers nothing more than annoying NSGEU members. Annoyance. They don't see them as workers who strive hard to make the lives of our most vulnerable citizens better. My question to the minister, why is this minister and this government not shown the respect that these workers deserve by putting even a little bit more on the table so that they can get back and negotiate?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I thank the member opposite for his question. I would point out that if he was to check Hansard over the last several weeks, that whenever I have mentioned the care workers that are with RRSS providing service to the residents, that I have often made reference to their wonderful character that they bring to the residents. They're very special people, and I've always maintained that position both within the House and outside the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
This government says that workers only require a community college degree, when in fact full-time employees need a university degree. And I've heard that workers indicate that they feel also that this government portrays them to the public as glorified babysitters, when in fact they save the system money as well as give excellent care. And given that this government in fact has created a crisis in adult mental health, the role of these workers has become even more vital as they're dealing with adults. My question to the minister, if this minister believes that workers are earning what they should, will he agree today to perform all of the tasks of an RRSS worker for one day so as to produce the proof he needs that the way he is treating these patients, these workers, are wrong? One day, Mr. Minister, to do all their tasks to convince you to do what is right.
Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I would point out to the member opposite again during this debate that's gone on over the last number of weeks that there was a recognition that there had to be standards set across the province. With those standards required certain training. The training requires community college courses. They've been done. There was an agreement that was reached that set what was the appropriate wage, and the wage that is paid in Nova Scotia compares favorably with the wages for comparable workers in other maritime provinces.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question will be to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, workers at the Regional Residential Services Society continue their job action because the province will not allow our RSS to go into binding arbitration. In the newspaper today, the Premier states, where all these conversations should be taking place is at the table. We couldn't agree more with the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we couldn't agree more with that Premier. And that is what the union has been saying for 3 weeks. The only party stopping that from happening is this government. I ask the Premier, since you are encouraging both sides to get back to the table, is your government, as sole funder, going to participate?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer that to the minister responsible.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for raising the point that it's very important to recognize that in the collective bargaining process there's an employer and there's a union, and as I have just stated in my answer to the previous questioner, we have been very careful to respect the collective bargaining process.
Now, Member Dartmouth North, on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker,
Order,
that
please.
minister and the government...
Order, please. Now, Member Dartmouth North has the floor.
That minister and the government has to get their heads out of the sand. Mr. Speaker, the union has been asking for binding arbitration before this strike even took place. They didn't want to take the job action, but they had no choice. Yesterday, the Minister of Community Services said the workers are being paid what they are worth. If that's the case, this government has nothing to fear from allowing our RSS to enter binding arbitration. I asked the Premier, if you're so intent on seeing negotiations resume, why won't you allow a neutral third party to bring this strike to an end?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the government, every step of the way, has respected the collective bargaining process. We believe that the next step should be a return to the table and to engage in conciliation.
The Member Dartmouth North, on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier says return to the table, but the Minister of Community Services says there's no new money to offer workers. RSS says it won't resume bargaining until there's something new to offer. I asked the Premier, if you really want negotiations to resume to end this strike, why won't you negotiate? Why won't your government allow RSS to enter binding arbitration?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As an answer to the previous question, the government's position has been made perfectly clear, and it has not changed in the few moments since you asked the previous question. The place to have this continue is at the table and to undergo an appropriate conciliatory process.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, on May 18, 1999, the then Minister of Transportation and Public Works and the then Liberal MLA for Shelburne announced the approval of a new high school to staff and students of Shelburne Regional High School. Mr. Speaker, this announcement was approved by the Department of Education and added to the capital projects list. My question to the Minister is, will the Minister provide an update on the progress of this previously announced school for the region of Shelburne?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell the honourable member and tell the House that that is a project that will be proceeding in the very near future.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay, on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again, my question is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the completion date for the school was announced by the then former Liberal Minister for the fall of 2004. Mr. Speaker, that is only 16 months away, and the tenders for the school have yet to be issued. The land has been purchased and cleared, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister inform the House and the residents of Shelburne when the tenders will be announced so the next phase of Shelburne Regional Memorial High School can begin?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated, we will be in a position to deal with this school in the very near future, and there has been work done with respect to the purchase of property, and the tender call, I believe, is imminent, and I will indicate to the House as soon as I know the precise date just when that will be.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay, on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my final question is again to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the residents of Shelburne are anxiously awaiting on this government for their new school. My question to the Minister is, will the Minister confirm that the construction of Shelburne Regional High School is still going ahead, and will he guarantee that it will be built by the fall of 2004?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, the main contract for that particular building is now out, and when the tender award is ready, then I will certainly inform the House, and that will be imminent.
The member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, 27 families who own homes and a trailer court on Millbrook Reserve have been...
Order, please. The member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 27 families who own homes in a trailer court in the Millbrook Reserve have been notified they have to relocate by July the 1st of 2003 due to a planned development on that land. They have been instructed that they will not receive any assistance to move, unlike other residents who live in homes leased out by the Band Council. These homeowners are low income and do not have the funds to relocate. Many have homes that will not be allowed in the other trailer parks. I asked the Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs, has he taken any steps to meet with the federal and Band Council representatives over this issue?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs.
Thank you. I'll refer to that to the Minister responsible for Housing, Minister of Community Services.
Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite brings up a good question. It is true that the Band Council has given the eviction to the residents. The residents are, as I understand it, trying to work with the federal government to see if they can get some sort of compensation. But in the meantime, provincially, we've gone in there, we've met with them, and we've encouraged them to set appointments with housing services to assist them.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These families are asking for $35,000 per family to help them relocate their homes by the deadline. They are asking that assistance be provided by the federal government in partnership with the province. The province has recently entered into an agreement to administer low-income, off-reserve native housing, and it has a role to play in resolving this situation. So my question this time, Mr. Speaker, will be to the Minister of Community Services. What help is his department willing to offer these 27 families to deal with this situation?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to clarify that the Band Council is taking care of the Aboriginal residents. It's the ones that are not Aboriginal that have been displaced by this. And it is to those ones that we have encouraged them to come. And in the case of those that might be on social assistance, to meet with their caseworker, and that we would work with them to find alternative accommodations. And for those that are homeowners, we have also encouraged them to speak with housing services to see what assistance we could provide them to find affordable housing.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your final supplementary.
Speaker, this is the only band-owned trailer court, and this problem is likely never to happen again. Any assistance rendered is a one-time deal, Mr. Speaker. And I will ask the Minister again, will he commit to working with these families, the federal counterpart, and the Band Council to resolve this situation as soon as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the answer is that we've already been working with them. They do have a matter that they're taking up with the federal government, and that is between them and the federal government. But in terms of trying to assist them to find alternative accommodations, we're already there working with them.
The honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. Mr. Speaker, people in rural Nova Scotia, they're not very demanding usually, and they don't expect instant service the way many in urban areas do, but they expect at least adequate services. People who live in Meath Cove, for example, are far away from the urban core, but when it comes to emergency services, the Bay St. Lawrence Fire Department is second to none. Unfortunately, this past March, the Hines family of Meath Cove were burnt out of their house while firefighters stood helplessly by. Fortunately, no one was killed. The reason volunteer firefighters couldn't help is that the road was impassable due to the lack of maintenance. There was no sand applied and the fire truck couldn't get into the village. My question to the Minister is, why were the people of Meath Cove neglected by your department?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much. I thank the honourable member for the question. It's obviously an important question. I'm not familiar with the particular events that the honourable member refers to, and obviously I'll take that under advisement and provide him with a response in the future.
The honourable member for Victoria on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister. Minister, the roads in the area were not kept up, we believe, to at least a minimum standard. There was no front-end loader to disperse sand, and crews have only an inadequate, cumbersome truck plough, which is unsuitable for certain conditions in the wintertime, particularly on ice. Residents of the area have met with DOT officials, but yet they haven't heard anything in since many, many weeks. So I would ask the Minister, would he simply provide the service to the residents through negotiations with the local DOT, to the residents of Meath Cove that all Nova Scotians deserve and expect?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, and again, thank the honourable member for the question. This matter had been brought to my attention by the member for Inverness. I'll try to find further details about exactly what arrangements have been made with the Department of Transportation, the local authority, and we'll provide it to the member.
Honourable member for Victoria on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, many of us who live in rural Nova Scotia, and particularly on dirt roads, we consider this a very serious matter when emergency service vehicles can't get into all these communities. So I would ask the Minister, will he meet with the residents of the area and the DOT officials and discuss this issue and address it so that next winter a tragedy like this won't happen and that it may be fatal?
Mr. Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, and thank the honourable member for the invitation to travel to Meath Cove. I'm not sure if when I'll be able to take him up on the invitation, but I can indicate to the honourable member on a number of fronts. First of all, there are standards for service in rural parts of this province, and we are determined as a department and a government to ensure that adequate standards for winter maintenance are maintained. And I can also remind the honourable member that it was this government who introduced the funds for rural roads, the so-called RIM program, which is making such a tremendous success in improving rural roads that deteriorated when he was a member of the former government.
The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. I contacted the Minister last month about the hardships faced by a family in my constituency who have a 3-year-old daughter who suffers from, among other things, the devastating genetic disorder Hurler syndrome. The condition has required that she have bone marrow transplants at the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto, and she needs constant medical attention. This family of moderate means is struggling to deal with the debts accrued because of her daughter's medical problems. But the mom's being hounded by collection agencies trying to collect on her student loan. The minister has said he cannot intervene, and I would like to ask the minister, is the minister still insistent that he can do nothing to help families with student loan problems?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member indeed did write to me with respect to the case he referenced. While I'm not in a position to be able to go into the details on that, we have in fact investigated the case to see what we could do by way of providing some relief, and we have explored all possibilities with respect to that within the legal framework that is available to me, and we will continue to do that. Thank you.
Time allotted for a question period has expired. Government business, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, please call the order of business public bills for second reading.
Public bills for second reading.
Would you please call Bill number 36, the Financial Measures Act 2003.
Bill number 36, the Financial Measures Act. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I was just wondering if there was a question. I was standing to speak.
Question period expired.
Yes, I know.
We're on bill number 36.
Yes, I know.
The honourable member for Glace Bay has the floor.
I appreciate the recognition, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise and then to speak on the Financial Measures Act. And
order, please. The honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture.
Mr. Speaker, if I could do an introduction, if the member would mind.
An introduction. The honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for his time. Mr. Speaker, in the West Gallery behind me, we have a group of students from Dalbury Academy, grade 9 students, and in my hometown of Mabou. And also, there's students from Judic area and Port Hood and Mabou and the Waikagam area. And Mr. Speaker, one of my former colleagues is with them, joining with them, as well as another teacher. We have Nadine Hunt, one of the teachers, as well as Melissa Cummings. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the grade 9s to rise and receive the warm welcome to the House. Welcome to Halifax.
Thank you. We certainly welcome our special guest to the gallery today and hope they enjoy the proceedings. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join you and the honourable minister in welcoming our guests to the gallery as well. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned and started, it's a pleasure to rise and speak on the Financial Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, the hoist for the Financial Measures Act in this case, asking for us to take the time for a 6-month period and discuss exactly what the Financial Measures Act will mean to all of us. Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess many will question why we spend so much time talking about these matters and why we spend so much time talking about issues such as debt, issues that are very important but may seem to some to be insignificant. Some will say, why should we care so much about debt when we need better education, we need better health care? Aren't there other more significant things that we should be spending our time talking about? And who cares about debt when we need such things as new roads? And who cares about debt when we need better health care, better education? And I'll be the first to admit, Mr. Speaker, that it really won't cross the minds of many Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. But that is the perfect example why we have to hoist this bill. Because the effect of debt on this province right now, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely staggering. So we have to care about debt, and we have to care about what it does. Because, Mr. Speaker, for the first time ever in the history of this province, debt servicing charges now represent more money than we spend on education. Over $1 billion. Over $1 billion that we now spend to service the debt. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's too many people who can argue that that is wrong. That is wrong. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, that every year for the foreseeable future, $1 billion will go to the banks just to cover off the interest on the debt and never paying back the principal, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, giving a tax cut at a time when we keep adding to the debt is unconscionable. It's wrong, and eventually, Mr. Speaker, in the end, it will have to be paid back. So the tax cut of today, Mr. Speaker, is the tax increase of tomorrow. Every dollar that we pay in debt is another dollar that will have to be paid back in higher taxes and higher user fees, as we've seen this government use on many occasions to not say the word taxes. They use user fees. But for all Nova Scotians, they'll have to pay back the higher tax or the user fee, and not just those who pay income tax either, Mr. Speaker. That will apply to every Nova Scotian. Mr. Speaker, the tax cut the government has proposed goes to over 400,000 income tax-paying Nova Scotians. But, Mr. Speaker, we can't forget about the countless others who have to pay higher fees and consumption tax on things like electricity, on things like gasoline and home heating oil, Mr. Speaker. So everyone who pays income taxes gets a break, and those who are left to pay all of the other fees and all of the other taxes will eventually have to pay for the debt. But they don't get the break, they don't get the check that's expected at the towards next month. Mr. Speaker, again, that's wrong. And that's why this bill, the Financial Measures Act, requires the scrutiny of a 6-month hoist. That's why we should take that time to take another look at this, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other thing the government has ignored is that it has not indexed tax brackets and credits to inflation. It's something, Mr. Speaker, that our party has called for in the past and will again when we can afford it. The lack of indexation means that any tax cut is not going to last, Mr. Speaker. And you know what that means? It means more tax, not less. Indexation means freezing tax at current levels. It does not mean tax relief. It means that in the future, governments won't be able to count on those secret backdoor tax increases, Mr. Speaker. Indexation means that people will see their tax cut eroded away by bracket creep. Now, Mr. Speaker, not a lot of us would understand the meaning of bracket creep. I probably would be among most of them, although it has been explained to me. It means that the tax cut today will be taken back tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, because of inflation. For instance, in Manitoba, they cut taxes as well, but they failed to index the tax brackets there, Mr. Speaker. And that means the tax cut in Nova Scotia, as well as in Manitoba, will all be gone out the window in short order because of inflation. So this is not a tax cut at all. And that, Mr. Speaker, is why we need 6 months so Nova Scotians know that they are not getting a tax cut, but what they are getting is a tax loan, Mr. Speaker. Taxation without indexation is a short-term measure. Mr. Speaker, my caucus's position on this is clear. We do favor tax relief, but not while we're borrowing to pay for it. That's not the solution, Mr. Speaker. It simply does not make sense to borrow more than you earn and still give a tax cut. Mr. Speaker, in the election, the John Ham Tories promised no new taxes and a $50 home heating rebate for every household in Nova Scotia. It would have cost the province about $17.8 million in fiscal 1998-1999. Taxation was not a large issue. During the 1999 election campaign, tax cuts were not front and center, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the Tory tax cut garnered very little attention compared to, for instance, the Health Investment Fund, or Cisco funding, or funding for primary education. But, Mr. Speaker, in reality, the tax cut issue seems to be a last-minute addition to the Tory platform. When initially asked whether he would promise a tax cut, it was John Ham that replied that Nova Scotians would not believe that promise because they know that it's not doable. And he went on to say, Mr. Speaker, that he would run a believable campaign, indicating once again that the tax cut idea was not initially believable. A quote that came from the Halifax Herald, June 19th edition, Mr. Speaker, of 1999. And surprisingly, when the Premier then announced his platform on the 25th of June, 1999, well, lo and behold, tax cuts were part of the Blue Book, Mr. Speaker. But perhaps no person was more surprised at the election outcome, Mr. Speaker, than the Premier himself. I'm sure that a lot of Nova Scotians were surprised, Mr. Speaker. It's become more apparent every day since this government took office, Mr. Speaker. For example, initially, the tax cut promise would cost $110 million. Now, that has subsequently risen to $140 million based on 10% of the revenues. Mr. Speaker, the 10% tax cut promise was simplistic in that it was never really elaborated on in terms of what it meant until well into the mandate of the Tory government. So actually, Mr. Speaker, the vagueness of the promise was actually part of its strength. And if they ever thought that they would fulfill the promise, nobody would be exactly sure what 10% meant anyway, Mr. Speaker. But now we know exactly what it means. It means that the government has scrapped the tax cut in favor of a one-time vote-buying scheme. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. A scheme that is going on, hoisted on Nova Scotia's borrowed money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was the February 2000 federal budget that marked a turning point in Canadian history because it contained the most significant tax cuts in this country's history, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. At the same time, what happened with that federal budget is that it eliminated what has become known as a bracket creep, what I referred to earlier, which is the full indexation of tax brackets and credits to inflation, Mr. Speaker. But again, bracket creep results in people being pushed into higher tax brackets because their income rises with inflation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I actually probably come across as I know what I'm talking about here. But you'd have to get an explanation, and it would be complicated, I know, because I found it complicated. But when you take a look at the big picture, and you have someone explain it to you, and you see that your income does rise with inflation, then you know it's worthless. The result is that the tax rate rises, even though incomes don't. They don't increase in real terms. Mr. Speaker, finance ministers from across this country, for them, the federal tax cut and the end of bracket creep would mean a reduction in revenue because provincial taxes were set as a percentage of the federal rate. But Mr. Speaker, that was not the case for the finance minister in Nova Scotia. Because the finance minister in Nova Scotia, he did something called delinking. And when he delinked, or decoupled, if I have the wrong word there, I may have the wrong phrase, delinked or decoupled, in effect what he did, he raised taxes. That's what happened. So for 3 years, there was actually an increase in taxes. The loss of bracket creep would be particularly alarming to any government that promised tax cuts because bracket creep provided a built-in hidden tax increase over the years. That's where it was. You know, like someone, for instance, Mr. Speaker, you were walking home one night and someone jumped out from the bushes and said, "Boo," and you were startled. This is where that hidden tax came from. All of a sudden it was there. You were startled, but the government and the finance minister knew about it all along. Mr. Speaker, even if a tax cut is given, finance ministers could always rely on bracket creep as an extra source of income. That's what it was. So the only solution for the province was to decouple or delink from the federal rate and set its own rates. So this new system was called tax on income. How am I doing? Excellent. Okay, delinking. Delinking meant that provincial taxes would remain the same. The federal tax cut would have no impact whatsoever on provincial revenues. Well, Mr. Speaker, there are significant advantages to the tax on income because it allows the province to be quite flexible with tax credits, but at the same time, it's not very good for a taxpayer. It's detrimental to the taxpayer because there's no corresponding tax reduction when the federal rate drops, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, what's even more insidious is that while bracket creep was eliminated at the federal level, it was continued provincially because of that delinking. Even though the province could have chose to index credits and brackets at that time. That was a choice left up to the province, Mr. Speaker. So the insidious part of bracket creep is that it amounts to, again, as I said, a hidden tax increase. Even if there is a provincial tax cut, the province can make it up over time, over a period of 3 years, as they've done, in this case, through bracket creep. Well, Mr. Speaker, in order to expose the hidden tax increase, it was the then finance critic for this party, that embarked on a campaign to get the government to commit to end bracket creep. And the reason for the call was as follows, Mr. Speaker. Full indexation would amount to a tax freeze and a fundamental reform of the provincial tax system. So in-taxing tax credits and tax brackets to inflation would provide the following: fairness, transparency, and accountability in the tax system. Can you imagine those 3 words, Mr. Speaker? Fairness, transparency, and accountability. 3 words that you have never heard before in the Tory caucus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the call for a tax freeze was followed up with a bill that would set up a committee to explore possible avenues for some meaningful tax reform while repeating the position. And the bill and a call for an end to bracket creep received some media attention